He made a come to us quite quick. I throttled him with the noose and he hardly struggled.
In the summer of 1993, Metropolitan Police were on the hunt for a killer who was seemingly selecting his victims from London's gay community.
Initially, it was just gay killer. First victim he picked up in this bar. Where would the next bar be? We didn't know.
The killer's murderous reign of terror would last 3 months and lead to the deaths of 5 innocent gay men.
The body was laid out on the bed, it was bound. The noose was still around his neck.
Detectives' worst fears were realised when the killer revealed his motive.
His motivation seems to have been this quest for infamy, to be a serial killer.
And once he killed them, he actually stayed with them for several hours.
He definitely was a man who needed to be locked away.
By the early 1990s, Soho had established itself as the centre of London's gay scene, and the area's bars, clubs and saunas were able to exist openly and in relative peace. One such venue was the Coleherne Arms, a dimly lit bar on Old Brompton Road. It had a reputation for attracting men who were into leather and sadomasochism.
The Coleherne back then was the destination venue for gay leathermen in London. The windows were blacked out, so you couldn't see inside. It was quite industrial, the decor inside. You did sometimes see sex on the premises.
Just a throng of people out for a good time to meet up and socialise with each other and to go off together. I mean, it really was a meeting place.
On the 8th of March 1993, 45-year-old Peter Walker, a renowned assistant theatre director working in the West End, visited the Coleherne. He was a regular there and openly gay. There were also suggestions that he was interested in the S&M scene. That night, he happened to bump into a man spilling his drink on him. After briefly chatting, the pair soon left together when Peter invited the man back to his Battersea apartment.
One of the tough realities that we as a community of gay men have to take on board is that we do put ourselves into very, very compromised situations where their safety could be at risk. It involves a huge amount of trust. This isn't to say that this is true of everybody, of course it isn't, but there is a sizable minority of gay men who will go out and they will go home with somebody knowing nothing about them. The chances are that not only do you not know them, but also that they're likely to be into bondage.
So we have a situation where Peter Walker has admitted a complete stranger into his flat with his keys, so there's no forced entry, agreed to being tied to a bed frame.
With Peter playing the role of the submissive, the stranger whom he had just met was about to reveal his true intentions. Far from being there for consensual sex, he was there to kill. With Peter restrained and unable to defend himself, the killer delivered a savage beating before suffocating him with a plastic bag.
He then remained in the flat, cleaning it and just being patient, waiting for the rush hour to begin in the early hours of the morning.
He wiped any surface that he had touched clean of his fingerprints. Moreover, he bagged up his clothing after he'd committed the crime and destroyed it.
And at 7 o'clock, he then left and just mingled out with the crowds and just blended into obscurity.
The killer harboured a terrifying obsession, and only weeks earlier had vowed to become a serial killer in a chilling New Year's resolution. His actions would go on to strike fear into the heart of London's gay community throughout 1993. One of the first detectives to arrive at the scene of Peter Walker's murder was Martin Finnegan.
Got a call from our uniformed colleagues saying they'd been called to a flat down by Battersea. Inside the corridor, there was a room on the left-hand side, the bedroom, and in there, Peter Walker was laying on the bed, covered by a duvet, which had some teddy bears on top, arranged in a 69 position, the 2 teddies on top. One of the most interesting things there was the ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, and there's no ligatures at the scene. So that raised the idea that whoever had killed him had taken away the ligatures and who knows what else as well.
In fact, The macabre scene that greeted Martin and his colleagues gave police their first indication that they were dealing with a particularly deranged killer. Chillingly, it would be a scene that would be repeated another 4 times before the killer was caught. An early sweep at the crime scene revealed that Peter's bank card was missing from the flat, and upon inspection, police discovered that money had been withdrawn from the account after Peter's murder.
He got into the habit in his early crimes of reimbursing himself for the expense of committing them, and having murdered them, he would go off to a cash point and using their PIN number and their credit card, he then took out, I think in certainly 3 cases, at least £200, I think.
But back in 1993, police were unable to identify who had made those cash withdrawals. And other than this, they had little to go on.
Peter's flat had been meticulously cleaned of any forensic clues by the person who left the flat last. So despite strenuous efforts by our forensic teams there, we were unable to get anything which would positively identify the last person in the flat. So that was frustrating. Our inquiries with his colleagues and friends had come to a natural end. There was really nowhere else for us to go.
Shortly after the discovery of Peter Walker's body, telephone helpline charity The Samaritans received a call from a man concerned about 2 dogs who he claimed were locked in Walker's flat.
The main thrust of his communication was there were some dogs locked up, been there for a couple of days, they need to be released. Oh, and by the way, how do you know that? Well, there's a dead man there. How do you know he's dead? I killed him.
With little forensic evidence at the scene, detectives from the Metropolitan Police quickly realised that they would have to rely on the cooperation of London's gay community to have any chance of catching his killer. But in the early 1990s, the relationship between the LGBTQ community and the police was taut with tension and underpinned by deep fear and suspicion.
Put it this way, when the police had gone to the coal home to try and get information, most of the people in the coal home will have remembered, not long before, 6 months maybe, the police turning up at the Vauxhall Tavern in Vauxhall, where Lily Savage was performing, and raiding the pub wearing rubber gloves in case they caught AIDS off people. So that's the kind of expectation of the police that we had as a community. So if the uniformed officers turning up at a gay venue, automatically people were very, very frightened and very hostile.
Perhaps this inquiry was a catalyst for getting both sides to work together. It was in everyone's interest that Peter Walker's killer was found, and there was no time for posturing as to the rights and wrongs of any sides there. We had work to do. We needed to find this killer, so let's work together.
Police say he'd been suffocated, and marks on his wrists suggest at some stage he'd been tied up.
We actively pursued Peter Walker's death. We left no stone unturned. We made diligent inquiries at the Coleherne pub and amongst the gay community. We built up a deep understanding of how Peter lived his life and his social activities, his sexual activities. So we knew an awful lot about Peter, and that gave us the strongest indication of probably how he met his death, but we didn't have that final link. So that was frustrating. Our inquiries with his colleagues and friends had come to a natural end. There was really nowhere else for us to go. So these inquiries cannot go on forever. There are implications for resources, so we did start scaling the inquiry down. And it was at that point then that other murders started happening.
After 10 weeks, detectives were nowhere nearer to solving the crime. What they didn't know at the time was that the person responsible for Peter's murder held a twisted desire to become a serial killer. His name was Colin Ireland. Ireland was born in 1954 in Dartford in Kent. His natural father walked out on his family shortly after Colin's birth, leaving his mother to bring him up alone. It would be the start of an unsettled and unhappy childhood.
If you look at his childhood, he had a very disturbed childhood. Mother was 17 when she had him, various partners coming in and out, various stepfathers, lots of moves, different schools, very much put into the role of a loner, an outsider. Does that explain his behaviour? No, because a lot of other people are unfortunately put in that situation and they don't kill. What we do know is that a lot of serial killers have dysfunctional backgrounds, but that's not to say everybody has a dysfunctional background is going to be a killer, because they're not.
Colin Ireland spent much of his formative years in and out of young offenders' institutions and borstal for various petty crimes.
Colin Ireland's history was that he had no hint that he was into sexual GBHs and assaults. He was a burglar, a bit of fraud, robbery.
After a first marriage that ended following an affair with another woman, Colin Ireland arrived in Devon, where he met his second wife, Janet Young.
I first met Colin when I had a pub. I was a publican in Devon. It was quite amazing, really, his first entrance into the pub. He was a big man and he was dressed in camouflage, although he has never actually been a soldier, although people describe him as that. He never described himself that way. And he stood in the doorway and the whole conversation in the pub just stopped and everybody turned and looked at him. We got talking and we spent nearly the whole night talking. We had quite a lot in common. We got married in January of 1990. We were both really rather control freaks, so I recognised that in him and he in me, and we both wanted the last word in any disagreement, although we didn't argue a lot, but if we were having a debate and so forth, we would all both want the last word.
The problem when you have control freaks, if you don't allow them to have control, then they can lose it. And I would imagine that his wife would have reported cases of incidents where he had lost his temper over something. Because if you break down that control or you challenge that control, they will respond with aggression.
It was late at night and I had a bed and breakfast and we'd gone to bed and we'd had a discussion and I had won and he had lost control of me. He threw me out of the bedroom into the hallway where all the guest bedrooms were. So I went into one of the empty guest rooms. He banged on the door and he came into the room and he broke the light bulb so that I couldn't see where he was. And he stood in different corners of the room and called out to me, saying, "I'm over here, I'm over here." Just really frightened me, actually. Didn't touch me, but it was scary.
What they normally do is put enough fear into the partners that the partners don't want to upset them, and then they control them that way. The fear of violence is often more powerful than the actual violence.
After marrying, the couple settled down and ran the Globe pub together. When he wasn't working at the pub, Colin would spend his time in Dartmoor, where he developed an interest in the outdoors.
He did like to see himself as a survivalist, and he had all the gear, the water purification tablets and all that kind of thing with him, and he'd go out on the moors and he was going to go all night and catch a rabbit and all this sort of thing. But actually, he wasn't very good at it, and he always came home for his tea.
After only a few months, Colin Ireland had quickly grown tired of married life. During the Easter holiday, Janet visited friends in London, leaving her new husband on his own.
He was due to come and pick me up on the Sunday, and he didn't come, and we assumed that there'd been an accident or something had happened, or a car had broken down. So we phoned the hospitals, we phoned the police, nobody had seen anything of him. We'd cleared my house out, everything went. And then he put my card in the machine and took out every penny that I had. I didn't even have the bus fare to get back from my parents there to lend me the money. I reported him missing, but the police said, well, he's just gone. I went bust. My children and I went into a homeless hostel. It was a nightmare.
Months after leaving Janet and seemingly vanishing from Devon, Colin Ireland resurfaced over 200 miles away in Southend, in Essex. There he quickly acquired work at a homeless shelter.
I was the manager of an emergency night shelter for homeless people in Southend, and Colin was one of a team of volunteers. First impressions of Colin were he's a very big man. He made it quite clear that he'd been to prison. He'd been involved in a robbery at a local cinema, and had tied up someone, a manager or someone at the theatre, and gone to prison for it. He did have some rather narrow opinions of certain sections of society. He was homophobic. He made it quite clear that he didn't agree with homosexuality. He didn't like the gay community at all.
Colin's job at the shelter demonstrated his ability to blend in with society and live a seemingly normal life.
One of the interesting things about serial killers is the normality. A lot of them are usually quiet, insignificant people, don't have a history of violence, and people are always shocked. I didn't know him, but he seemed a very nice chap, is what you hear. He's usually insignificant. He's not the kind of guy that when you see walking up the street, you cross the road because you think this one's going to be trouble. He isn't. Most serial killers don't have a very violent personality that's on display. They have a violence underneath, but not on display. They're not born evil. They learn about being evil or bad or whatever as part of the way they grow up, part of the world they live in. But he wouldn't have been easily identifiable.
Ireland almost managed to completely hide his dark side from his colleagues at the shelter. But his former co-worker, Richard Higgs, recalls one occasion in which Ireland appeared to reveal the true extent of his violent capabilities.
On one occasion, we had a particularly troublesome client at the night shelter who kept coming back and causing trouble over and over again. Colin, I assumed, was in jest, suggested one day that he would be able to get rid of him. When I asked him, in a light-hearted way, how, he suggested that he could force a couple of snooker balls down his throat and get rid of him that way.
After a year of working at the night shelter, Colin's colleagues were growing concerned at his increasingly bizarre behaviour.
There had been some allegations during that time of inappropriate touching of some of the female members of staff, and as a result of that, Colin was asked to leave. After Colin left the night shelter, he just used to go off on what we thought were survival weekends. And on those occasions, he used to ask me, or me and my wife, to look after his bag and his belongings because he didn't think they were safe to be left in his bedsit where he lived. In hindsight, it appeared that on those occasions, he wasn't going camping, he was going to London.
Having seemingly got away with the murder of Peter Walker, Ireland's killing spree continued throughout the early part of 1993. And 2 months on from his first murder, Ireland was about to strike again. On the 28th of May, he met 37-year-old librarian Christopher Dunn at the Colhern. Just like he had done with Walker, Ireland accompanied Dunn back to his flat. Once inside, he tied Christopher to the bed and burnt him with a cigarette lighter until he revealed his PIN number, before strangling him with a length of cord. Afterwards, Colin Ireland once again meticulously cleaned the flat before stealing money from his victim's bank account.
Christopher Dunn lived in Willesden, a single man living alone, and he was found face down, naked on his bed. The pathologist who examined the body said that he wasn't quite sure about the cause of death. It could have been manual strangulation through a sex act, a homosexual sex act that had gone wrong.
The uncertainty surrounding the death of Christopher Dunn meant that the inquiry was wound down. Colin Ireland had once again managed to evade the attention of the police. Just a week later, he was ready to kill again.
I think that Colin Ireland picked up his victims at places like the Colhern was not accidental. Those spaces invited people who were maybe loners, maybe felt cut off from their surroundings, from their neighbours, from their families. So it was harder for the police to trace them. If you're broadcasting your sexual choices by the way you dress, by the code of the way that you look, which kind of proclaims not just that you're gay, but also that you're possibly into S&M and bondage, etc., etc., that kind of provides a very, very fertile hunting ground for somebody who would like to come and do you harm.
The lifestyle lent itself to exploitation. Clearly there's a certain element of trust that needs to go on between consenting people, and in which case this trust was betrayed. Possibly Colin saw the gay community as easy pickings.
On the 4th of June, detectives received news of a third murder. This time, the victim was an American businessman working in London, 35-year-old Perry Bradley.
I was on call as the senior investigating officer. The news of a body having been found in Kensington came in, and we went out to the scene, and that was Perry Bradley. The body was laid out on the bed, it was bound, the noose was still around his neck. There was no obvious sign of any struggle or fight. The crime scene indicated that there were sexual motivations. The way the body was arranged and laid out, it was clearly a little bit unusual. And we were a little bit surprised when we contacted the family and found that there was no apparent history of homosexuality or anything in his background whatsoever.
The confusion about Perry Bradley's sexuality, along with the initial assumption that Christopher Dunn's death may not have been in fact a murder, meant that the Metropolitan Police now had 3 teams separately investigating the crimes of Colin Ireland. And just days later, police would make yet another shocking discovery.
Well, I was on call, Detective Superintendent for murders in the East End of London. I got a call to say that a man called Andrew Collier had been killed.
33-year-old Andrew Collier was a caretaker at a block of flats in northeast London. Openly gay and HIV positive, he was a regular at the Coleherne. It was on a visit there on the evening of the 7th of June that he met Colin Ireland. 2 days later, his lifeless body was discovered in bizarre circumstances in his own flat.
We had an untidy bed, and we had an untidy bedroom, first room on the right, a naked body lying in that position, flat position, head on the pillow, with a cat draped across the body with a condom in the cat's tail, and a condom in the mouth of the cat as well, on the penis of the victim.
Detectives immediately noticed similarities between this unusual scene and the murder of Peter Walker 3 months earlier. Like the previous victim, Andrew Collier's keys were missing, and he had been robbed. Inquiries with local officers also provided another crucial breakthrough.
I made inquiries of the local police to see if they'd had any calls at the scene. Had we missed an opportunity for a witness, and we confirmed that there'd been quite a serious street fight about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. Aware of that, what would you do if you heard noise at 1 o'clock in the morning? You get out of bed and have a look out the window. And when you look out the window in the lounge, there's a bar across Collier's front room, and between the glass of pane and the bar, there was a finger mark facing downwards, and that's a mark that was lifted. So, great bit of forensication done by the officers at that scene.
Until now, Ireland's meticulous attention to detail in cleaning each scene had helped him evade capture. But by leaving a fingerprint in Andrew Collier's flat, he presented the police with their first solid clue to his identity. However, back in 1993, no computerized database of prints existed to search against. Only when a suspect was arrested could comparisons be made. For the time being, Ireland was once again seemingly in the clear. But the different inquiry teams investigating the murders across London were beginning to notice unusual similarities in the crime scenes.
Somebody brought to my notice the circulation concerning the Collier murder at that time, and we looked at it and thought, hey, there's similarities here. I need to talk to Albert about this.
We talked on the phone, we shared crime scene photographs. He was concerned around making a link to the Collier and Walker case.
It became known to me that the method in which Andrew Collier's body had been found was almost identical to Peter Walker's. So, if nothing else, that was a vital link between those two murders.
We fairly quickly, I think, identified Walker, Bradley, Collier and Dunn was a linked series. And we called a meeting of the respective investigating officers. And I remember it very well because we were talking about going over the forensics once again, the bodies, to see if we could find any common factors there, now that we knew it was probably a linked series. And I very well remember the guy from Wealdstone, the Dunn murder, saying, well, that may be a little bit difficult because at this moment, as we speak, he's being cremated. And our hearts sank at that point, but nevertheless, you know, that was the way that Dunn was brought into it. But fortunately, there was quite a lot of information available from the Dunn investigation that we were able to draw upon and pull into our investigations as well.
There are links with all 4 murders, and that was pathologically established this afternoon.
With detectives now sharing intelligence, it became clear that there was a link between the murders of Walker, Dunn, Bradley and Collier. Police grew suspicious that they were in fact dealing with a serial killer, and their suspicions were confirmed when they received a telephone call from an unlikely source.
On Saturday the 12th of June, the CID office at Battersea received a phone call from a man inquiring as to why the Peter Walker inquiry had been wound down, asking were we not interested in the death of a gay man. And he went on to say that he had killed him. He told us that he had already killed Mr. Bradley in Kensington, Christopher Dunn in Wealdstone, and Andrew Collier in Hackney, and said that he was going to carry on, that he wanted to be a serial killer, and it was his New Year resolution, and he carried on until we caught him.
Why are you doing this? But what was your aim in all that?
Once you know you're dealing with a multiple killer, your priorities change, and it's the protection of life then that becomes of absolute paramount importance, because this guy could be out there ready and wanting to kill again.
As a killer, he's unusual in the sense that he's actually broadcasting his behaviour. He was the one that actually was saying, this is what I've done.
I think with most serial killers, there's this element of play and taunting the police. So certainly, he was playing games and he wanted the notoriety. What really frustrated him was the fact that we hadn't made any connections with the first killing, and even the second killing had gone unnoticed, when what he wanted was to be a serial killer. And so this is why he was trying to court the publicity, trying to get us to declare it to be a linked series in order that he could thrive in the publicity.
Detectives were stunned when the man claiming to be the killer called again days later.
To have a killer contacting the authorities twice within a matter of days, making statements like, I killed them, and that was effectively a taunt. Why haven't you caught me yet? I'll carry on, I'll do some more. Again, highly unusual. This is not a man wishing to keep a low profile.
It was during this second phone call that Ireland revealed that he had killed again. He had met Emmanuel Spiteri in a tube station after noticing him at the Colhern on the evening of the 12th of June. The pair had returned to Spiteri's flat, and after stealing his cash card and PIN number, Ireland had strangled him. After Spiteri's landlady discovered his body, police soon established that Emmanuel Spiteri was a regular at the Colhern. They pieced together a route between his flat and the pub and noticed that the most likely way home went through Charing Cross Station, a station that had just been fitted with one of London's first CCTV cameras.
After about 10 hours of viewing, we got the victim, Spiteri, with an image in the background that ended up being Colin Ireland.
The priority was to protect life, and we felt that the image was sufficiently good so that two things might flow from that. A, people would be able to avoid him if he approached them at the Colhern, and B, somebody who knew him well would probably, from the build, even though the facial features were a little bit distorted, from his build, height and general demeanour of the footage, would be able to identify him, and so that triggered us into releasing the information.
After discovering the crucial CCTV footage, police made the decision to release the image. Within days, they were inundated with calls and potential leads, with Gallup, the gay London policing group taking hundreds of calls.
I think once there was the CCTV footage showing a man, that sort of changed the whole game really, because suddenly here was somebody that people could see and recognise, and that could have been your next door neighbour walking along. The phones at Gallup went mad. People were phoning up nearly every day, either saying that they may have information. Was it safe to go to the Coleherne? Was it safe to be dressed in leather? I mean, people became really paranoid. There was this real sense of fear within the community.
All sorts of names were propped up that had to be dealt with. So how do you prioritise? Which line of inquiry are you going to deal with first? The pressure was immense, you know. We did go through a very difficult time.
As the Metropolitan Police investigation stepped up, 40 miles away in Southend, Colin Ireland was keeping one eye on detectives' frantic attempts to track him down.
Colin was here. It was the news. They were talking about the gay slayings, as it was called. And Colin turned to me and asked me, he said, what do you think of this then? And my response was, oh, another nutter on the loose. And he just laughed.
As the media tension grew, Colin Ireland could not escape the fact that the net was finally closing in on him.
A couple of his associates, acquaintances, had gone to him and said, hey, Colin, that could be you.
I noticed an identikit picture in a local newspaper. And I thought to myself, oh, it looks like Colin. I didn't pay much attention to it and just generally dismissed it. And of course, when the press turned up, that was one of the things that came to mind. And I realised that, yeah, it was definitely Colin.
As Scotland Yard's massive publicity campaign began to stretch beyond London, Colin Ireland realised the game was up. On July the 19th, he approached his solicitor in Southend and signed an affidavit, admitting that he was the man in the photo, but claiming no knowledge of Spiteri's murder.
He went to a solicitor after seeing his image on television, saying, I am the man in the video, but I'm not the killer. Yes, I did go to the Coleherne. I met Manuel Spiteri there. He invited me back to his flat in South London. We travelled on the train through Charing Cross. When I got to the front door, there was another man there. I didn't want to have a threesome, so I left immediately and slept in the local churchyard.
Albert Patrick, examining recordings of Ireland's various phone calls, had uncovered a key background noise that originated from Fenchurch Street train station, the line that serves Southend. 2 days later, Ireland's solicitor, under instruction from his client, called the police.
We went to his lawyer's office to speak to him. We obviously arrested him and interviewed him. The crucial thing was that at that point we were able to get his fingerprints, having arrested him.
Police immediately compared Ireland's fingerprints to those found on the window at Andrew Collier's flat. It was a perfect match.
We knew that he had been in the company of Spiteri, that we had a fingerprint of him inside Collier's flat, which he denied ever being to. So that gave us sufficient evidence, and we decided to charge him initially, I think, just with the 2 murders, because what he wanted was the notoriety of being a serial killer. And we felt with him just being charged with the 2 murders, it would cause him quite a bit of frustration. And so that's what we did, and then we waited to see how things developed.
3-4 weeks later, when he was coming back for our hearing at the Magistrates' Court, that's when he said to his escorting officer that he wanted to confess. We had officers to escort him, so they took a brief note of what he was saying on the way back, took him to Edmonton Police Station where there was a new video system.
For a long time, he denied it and then decided eventually to do it. And that's classic serial killer, is that serial killer keeps all the cards to himself, and then when he realises that the police have most of the cards, he then throws a hand in.
I killed him with the plastic bag. I put that over his head and killed him with that.
He decided to tell all, and he admitted to us the full extent of his involvement.
He made it come to us quite quick. I told him with the news. He hardly struggled. And Simon, for instance, Walker, it took longer.
His interview, I found him willing to talk. I found him articulate and quite happy to provide details. He didn't need much prompting, just a few questions to sort of target his responses, and he was quite happy to talk away.
He was calm, relaxed, you know, he didn't raise his voice.
Tell me about the cat. How did you kill the cat? I stuck a noose around its neck and hung it over a door.
Very factual about his acts, as if he was describing someone else's activities. Absolutely no compassion at all.
Tell me again how Christopher Dunn died. Christopher Dunn, with some cord and manual strangulation.
I didn't detect much hatred at the time. It was just matter of fact. Like, I went down the shops, I bought this, went into this flat and killed him. It was just very matter of fact. A very unusual interview.
Ireland wasn't remorseful. Ireland positively boasted and gloated over the fact that he was a serial killer.
In a series of chilling police interviews, Ireland confessed his crimes in horrifying detail. But investigators were no closer to uncovering his motive and questioned Ireland about his own sexuality.
We questioned Colin Ireland very closely about his sexual orientation, because having moved in gay circles and going home with gay men and murdering gay men after what could have been some sexual activity, it would have made sense had he been gay himself. But throughout all the interviews there, he absolutely refuted any suggestion that he was gay, which left the situation that he was even more calculated and cold than we first thought. For a heterosexual to go into a gay area to pick up gay men to kill them is a truly chilling dimension. His motivation seems to have been this quest for infamy, to be a serial killer. That seemed to be what drove him, and he worked at it until he achieved that aim.
It was the victim he was looking for. He was looking for somebody to kill, and gay S&M men are vulnerable in that sense. But he could have easily have killed prostitutes. It didn't really matter to him. It was the killing that was enjoyable. And as far as I understand, he never had sex with any of his victims. There's no evidence at all of any sexual attraction to gay men. So it wasn't homosexual type behaviour. It was simply they were vulnerable.
As well as recounting in extreme detail how he killed his victims, Ireland revealed the true extent of how he was able to ensnare them before murdering them. His ability to convince total strangers to do his bidding was a character trait that those who knew him recognised.
Colin was very manipulative, appeared to be genuine, and as a result was able to convince people to trust him and possibly go along with whatever he was planning at the time.
Perry Bradley was not into sadomasochism or bondage, and Ireland convinced him that this was the only way he could get any gratification, that he, Ireland, could get that. And so Perry Bradley agreed to go along with that, just as an example of his MO. So he was quite chillingly ruthless in the way that he went about his task. And after he'd killed Perry Bradley, he made himself a sandwich and stayed there until the morning when there were more people on the street, and he felt he could more effectively make good his escape and mingle in with the commuters. Very chilling character.
He actually stayed with them for several hours, and that indicates to me somebody who's got incredible amount of control and being able to sit there, watch television, knowing that you've killed somebody, knowing that you've got to kill time so that you can then make an orderly exit. If he left at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, that would be noticeable. If he leaves at 7 o'clock in the morning, he's just one of the great commuter class and nobody would notice it. That shows a lot of insight into behaviour.
Colin Ireland pleaded guilty to all 5 murders, and he was deemed so dangerous that he was sentenced to 5 life sentences with no possibility of ever being released from prison.
I don't think anybody in court ever actually forget what the judge said, because having detailed the dreadful nature of the way Ireland killed his victims, the judge said to take 1 life is an outrage. To take 5 lives is carnage.
He definitely was a a man who needed to be locked away. And he said he was 60% okay, decent guy, and 40% a nudging him to kill gay men. And I think that's absolutely right.
I think we're all born with the ability to go any direction. We've got all those things in us, good and evil, but our upbringing directs us in one way, and most of us try to be good, and some of us can't. And I think, you know, that he let the bad side of his nature take over, and where most of us fight against that, he let it take him over.
There is an understandable human reluctance to imagine that anybody who can commit crimes of this gravity and this number cannot be normal by any canon that you or I or any other person might understand. The awful truth, I'm afraid, is that there are people who are just plain bad, and Colin Ireland was undoubtedly one of them.
He wasn't mad or insane or psychotic or whatever way we want to describe him. And sometimes people want their killers to be insane because it's easier to cope with it. But when you have somebody who wasn't insane, that's much more worrying, because we could all do that.
Almost 3 decades on from Colin Ireland's terrifying killing spree, as well as making fundamental changes to the way murders are investigated, the police have worked hard to develop a solid, trusting relationship with the gay community.
The fact that we now have LGBT liaison officers, the fact that anti-gay hate crime is actually treated seriously by the police. And I think because of that, the community is much more willing to work with the police when such things happen, which wasn't the case before. 20 years ago, that just wasn't the norm. That was the exception to the norm.
Colin Ireland died of natural causes in Wakefield Prison in February 2012. He was 57. His crimes, however, still linger with the detectives who helped catch him.
My impression of Colin Ireland was absolutely focused on his mission. It was a perverse mission, but one which he carried out with consummate skill, determination. He wanted to have his place in history as a serial killer. That is sadly what he achieved. 5 people lie dead at his hand.